Hi everyone, Mrs. Belo here. I'm just going to go over the last bit of the photosynthesis notes and then just add in a couple other big picture ideas. All right, so first, just to review, in the light reactions, we split water and we also used sunlight energy in order to make ATP and NADPH, which were used in the dark reactions. And in the dark reactions, that's where we saw the use of CO2. And that is how we ultimately made glucose. And then we also made oxygen in the beginning of the light reactions when we split that water. Put a 6 there. So this is the overall chemical equation for photosynthesis, and essentially it is just the opposite of cellular respiration. But one of the important things to note is that this obeys what we call the law of conservation, and that's that energy and matter cannot be created or destroyed. So the atoms, the carbon, the oxygen, the hydrogen, those aren't being created or destroyed. Rather, they're just being rearranged. The amount of atoms of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen is the same on either side of this equation. They're just being rearranged. And then energy is ultimately just changing forms. So kind of the big picture is that energy comes from that sun. Plants use it, pretend that's a flower, to make glucose, and then that gets eaten by an animal or humans, and we use that to make ATP for ourselves. We'll get more into this idea when we get into ecology, but that's kind of the big picture here, is that energy is ultimately coming from the sun. Plants are using it to make chemical energy, glucose, and then we as humans use that chemical energy to make ATP. Now, in a plant, I mean, as a human, like you breathe in oxygen and you exhale carbon dioxide, but how do plants do it? So plants have what's called a stomata, which is it's a mouth or a pore. It's usually on the undersides of leaves, and this is how carbon dioxide gets in and oxygen leaves the plant. You can also have water enter this way in the form of water vapor, which is when water is in the gas form. And typically these things, they look like this. That's actually pretty accurate what they look like under a microscope as well. And these little pores can actually open and close. So, and like especially here in like the Midwest, for example, in the summer when it is really hot out, usually those stomata will close, and that's to prevent water loss. And then, however, we do have to open them back up to allow that carbon dioxide and the oxygen out, because you need that carbon dioxide to do the dark reactions. Now, some things that can affect how fast photosynthesis is occurring. Obviously, as humans, we need glucose and oxygen to do cellular respiration. And when we don't have that, fermentation can take place. There are other things that can affect plants as well in terms of if they can do this or not. Obviously, if they have no oxygen and there's like certain other things present, you can ferment plants to make alcohol. But we're just talking about if the levels are changing and we're still able to do photosynthesis. So we're talking about light. We're not talking about temperature. We're talking about sunlight. So with increasing light, so like light intensity, electrons become more excited, and this generally increases the rate of photosynthesis. Now, a really good example of this is in the Midwest, especially. Here in the Midwest, when it's summertime and we have a lot of sunlight present, we are definitely going to see a lot more plants. Versus typically in the winter, when we have less sunlight, especially right now, those plants are going to start to be less. And also it is getting colder. but a lot of it also has to do with the sunlight. You kind of already start to see that in the fall when we start having less and less sunlight. Those plants aren't able to do photosynthesis as much, so you don't see as much plant growth as you do in the summer. However, there is like a cap where we can only go so fast, and there would be a point where that rate of photosynthesis is plateaus and it is constant, which would be right here, because there's only like X amount of electrons that you can use at one time. Another thing is carbon dioxide levels. If you do have typically more carbon dioxide with increasing carbon dioxide, the rate of photosynthesis, this is missing here, this should say increases after it. And again, because you need this for the dark reactions to occur versus this you need for the light reactions to occur. And again, we can only use so much carbon dioxide at once. And again, that rate would be constant at some point or it would plateau. And the amount of carbon dioxide just depends on maybe what area those plants are located in. Now, temperature is something different. This is how hot and cold, which may kind of be influenced by light intensity a little bit, but it's also kind of where you're located on planet Earth as well. Typically, when temperature increases for like any type of photo or any type of reaction, increased temperature typically increases the rate of any chemical reaction, including photosynthesis. However, there's a point when things can get too hot. If you recall back to our biochemistry unit, when we talked about proteins, specifically enzymes, right? They have what we call an optimal rate at which they work. There's a peak on that graph. And the thing is, if the plants get too hot, enzymes in plants basically denature, and then those enzymes stop working, and the same thing happens if it gets too cold. So usually it depends on the type of plant you're talking about. In the Midwest, we live in a pretty temperate environment. Generally, we're kind of somewhere in the middle. It's not too hot, not too cold. Obviously, as you get closer to the equator, it gets hotter. As you get farther away from the equator, it gets colder. And it also depends on what area you live in the United States or even in the world for that matter. What type of plants might thrive in those environments, which can definitely be influenced by evolution as well. And so it depends on the plant and the enzymes and at what temperature that plant will function best at.